Everyone, and welcome to my Leaving Cert Religious Education predictions for 2025. Now, basically, I want to say as a disclaimer, this video is my own predictions for this Leaving Cert year. Again, do not take this as canon, for lack of a better term, because again, I'm not saying these are definitely coming up, just more so my own predictions based on what I looked at over the past 5 years, based on what the mock paper said, and maybe what hasn't come up as well, maybe what's due to come up. So hopefully this will be somewhat helpful to yourselves. And if anyone has any further questions about the video afterwards, or even help with corrections or grinds, please contact the bcteaching@gmail.com. Now, first off, just going to go through a quick breakdown of how the exam paper will look. So the breakdown of the exam paper and exam paper only is 320 marks, and that's divided into three sections: Unit 1, Unit 2, and Unit 3. Unit 1, as you can see here on the screen, is 80 marks, whilst Unit 2 is 160, and Unit 3 being 80 again. Unit 1 is Section A, the search and meaning, as you might recall looking at that maybe in the start of fifth year or maybe this year as well. But that will usually have a combination of two questions. And again, you cannot mix and match with those questions. And there's no change to that regarding the amendments they brought in for COVID. So you usually might get a combination of questions such as a philosophy question, maybe a religious question, or maybe a mythology question and a cosmologies question. Either way, there's no mixing and matching, so it has to be a combination of one. So be careful that you might like one question in a combination and not like the other. So see what's the best regarding your marks, which two questions will you likely get the most marks in. Unit 2 is where you have the most work to do, and that's divided into three different sections. You have to answer two of them. And that's Section B, Christianity, C, World Religions, and D, Moral Decision Making. Now, additional questions will be added for the amended exams, so you'll likely get in each of those sections 3 questions you have to do too. So on that note, 3 sections you have to do too, and each of those sections there's 3 questions you'll likely have to do too, if not more questions. So bear that in mind. And I will be going through predictions in each of those 3 topics, and all of my notes on those topics are available on the ExamRevision website too. And Unit 3 is the elective section, so you do one of the 4 elective topics. And you'll only see Section F, Justice and Peace, G, Prayer and Ritual, I, the Irish Experience, and J, Religion and Science. As the Bible and Literature for Section H and E, Religion and Gender, were already used for the project based, they will not be on this elective topic. Bear that in mind. Now, most of you will only cover one of those topics with your teachers. Bear in mind, some of the questions will cross over, so you never know on the day if you do see questions that might be more relevant to you from your notes you've looked at, but just be careful if you do that. Having said that, I would advise you stick to your elective topic you covered with your teacher or tutor, whoever you worked with. Finally, bear in mind after the exam, your project, your journal work will also take up to 80 marks. Usually 20% of the overall or 25% for ordinary level. That is going to max out your total marks of 400. In addition, so 320 marks for your paper, then 408 marks adding on. The project will usually, if it's done correctly, will usually maybe bring up a few percentages, but maybe not necessarily an entire grade. However, it could be the difference between your H3, H4, your H3, H2. So make sure you give a good amount of detail to your project. Be conscious of all what the questions are asking. Again, if anyone has any further questions or even concerns, if you want any kind of going through what their projects are like, breakdowns on it, please do not hesitate to contact me at the email I provided in the previous slide. Now, on to the breakdown of the actual paper. So again, going into Section A, Unit 1, this is the section where a lot of people usually predict the philosophers. Now, by no means are the philosophers expected to come up, or are they mandatory they have to come up. They're just usually trendy that they will come up because they have to take up such a large part of Section A. So for what I did for this specific topic, I looked at what trends came up over the last 5 years, basing it back to 2019. And I've noticed that the sophists were the ones that came up the most furthest away, I should say, back in 2019, with Aristotle in 2021, Plato in 23, Socrates in both 24 and 2020, and of course the Christian philosophers came up in 2022. I'll also point out there was actually a secular question on the philosophy and since the Enlightenment last year. By no means does that mean it won't come up 2 years in a row, but having said that, it's probably less likely considering the mental options they have. Again, if they do follow the trend of asking a question of philosophy, they could also ask a question and trace the development of philosophy from Greek times up to modern times. So you could be expected to bring in your humanist philosophers like Karl Marx, Albert Camus, Erasmus, whoever you covered. So bear in mind that could also potentially be asked too. But likely, if I was to predict something, I would probably likely predict the sophists. Aristotle is also a contender. Both of those philosophers were asked in either mock, respectively. I won't say which one was asked in which, but it's just for the sake of the mocks are usually a fair prediction of what's coming up next year. But again, like myself, they're only predictions. Plato Again, came up 2 years ago. Is it likely to come up again? No. Same for Socrates. But again, I would not be afraid to actually know them, especially if a sophist question came up, because Socrates played on Aristotle, may react to the sophist, especially Socrates. So you could talk about that as well in detail. So no harm to know bits and bobs in all of the philosophers, because again, they could come up in some shape or form, and they can always be asked to compare them to your other questions in other sections, such as section D, or so maybe actually in sections such as F or in section J as well in some ways. Now, if we were to ignore the philosophers for a second, we might note which topics were absent for the past 5 years. So I noticed that the rites of passages in ancient religions and myths, so regarding Romans, toga virilis could be a topic, or the Newgrange topic could be something they talk about for burial rites. That's something you could bring in, and that's all found in section A 3.1. Again, that has not been asked for a few years. In 2022, they asked about the myths themselves, but not the rite of passages, so be careful of that. Interpretations of God, again, Freak was actually asked in one of the mocks as well, and quite a likeable question. Again, be careful that they sometimes ask a combination of the 5 points, so prophetic, mystical, aesthetic, poetic, and holy. Having said that, some years they usually ask the 5. It would be quite mean if they don't ask all 5, but again, they're welcome to do what they want, so just be careful on that one. The contemporary searcher meaning and the blocks of the searcher meaning. So those two questions have not come up for a good few years. And again, they're also asked in the mock. I would just say be careful. If you see those questions come up, they will be likely be very, very popular, which means the marking scheme will be a lot more difficult for them. If you have so many students talking about the contemporary cert and films and art and literature, etc., they will be looking for a specific thing. So how well defined is the contemporary search for film and art and music actually explained? Or are you just summarizing your favorite film and talking about how great it is? So just make sure you're very, very careful you're answering the question on that one. I've seen a lot of students in the past go off on tangents, just talk about why certain films are so great, maybe with special effects. That's all irrelevant. You have to talk about the meaning, the analysis of the film itself, and again, talk about contemporary film and how the themes are relevant and more so than anything else. You're not just giving a summary, an English summary, or an English review on a film or a piece of music or a piece of art. Blocks of the search meaning as well. Again, I say this could likely be a question as well with everything going on in the world, all the war, all the kind of devastation going on. Again, these questions, these exams usually kind of reflect what's going on in the past year. So with everything going on with America, everything going on with Israel, Palestine, Ukraine, there could be a question like that where you could bring in the topic of how war can block people's search for meaning. In my notes, I talk about failure, trauma, and the difference. By no means are you restricted to those. You could talk about alcohol addiction, you could talk about family trauma, you could talk about wars that are going on in the world. So if you're doing topics like section D, where you have to react to crime and punishment, that could be a good thing to bring in there as well. Remember, a lot of these subjects will cross over, so do not be afraid to make sure you bring in topics you learn from different topics altogether, because again, the examiner wants to see that you know what you're talking about for skill, not just through knowledge and understanding the actual question. So bear that in mind. On to our Unit 2. So the potential first section, Unit 2, is question B, Christianity. In section B, again, these are based on what I think may come up and what has not come up over the past 5 years. So there's usually always a Jesus question. So you can't have Christianity without Jesus, can you? But bearing in mind, there's usually a question talking about Jesus' conflict with maybe the Jewish groups or the Roman groups, or maybe how the Roman or Jewish groups interact with each other. Last year, there's a focus on the Jewish groups. This year, there could be a focus on Jesus' rule, issues with the Roman rule, or Roman rules in Palestine itself. So there's usually that kind of question. And again, with Palestine and Israel being topical at the moment, it's likely to show face again. Evidence about Jesus, however, has not come up for a while. And again, that's a very usually quite a nice question where it asks you about certain historians and how they interact or how they reacted to the times of Jesus. Again, something I would say has a potential contender coming up, and again was also asked in the mocks. So I'd say to you, just make sure you know your Pliny the Younger, your Tacitus, your Josephus, maybe your evangelists, and talk about how they interact with each other. The question might specifically ask you on certain historians, or might ask you about it in general. So make sure you know your actual historians' names. Again, make sure you know the distinctions between them and all as well, especially when it comes to Pliny and Tacitus. And also then for Josephus, knowing what the differences were, who were kind of more on side of Jesus, who were kind of more in the favour of Roman times, etc. And as you can see, you can find notes in that one for section B 2.2. So don't be afraid to look those up if you have the ExamRevision subscription. Now, one question that has been asked for a few years, if I'm correct in saying it, is the Christology writers. So in my notes, I covered Elizabeth Johnson and Jürgen Moltmann. Again, by no means are you restricted to those two, but they're the notes I would recommend. Again, Johnson talks about feminism, Moltmann talks about eschatology, so looking for hope in Christianity, and feminism looking for hope looking for aspects of development of women over the course of Christianity. So again, nice enough question. Doesn't always cross over other topics, unfortunately, but it's not too difficult to look over. And again, a lot of things you can compare them to as well. So the notes will all cover that as well. Haven't seen that question come up for a few years, but it's not the worst question to get. Christian communities as well. Thessalonica, Corinth, or Philippi. Again, have not seen that for a few years, and potentially could have come up as well. Again, with the focus on the Middle East and how the kind of Christianity, all these religions arguing over the Middle East, how Christianity actually started, could be a strong input there. Again, just a random guess, but again, I haven't seen it in a few years, and it has a contender coming up. And I think it was also asked in the mocks. So all those topics in front of you are likely asked in the mocks and have a potential contender coming up. Again, I'm not saying by no means are these the only ones that will come up. They could ask questions that were asked last year as well, repeat the process. But just bearing in mind, these are my predictions. And I'd be very surprised, especially for Section B, if one of those topics in front of me does not come up for the exams this year. Now, rolling on to Section C. With the census in 2022 results being out, I was actually surprised to not see it last year, but I do think there will be some sort of question talk about patterns of change or challenges or community of believers, especially with the film small things like these being released last year. Challenges could potentially come up again as well. So again, trying to base it on what current trends are going on. So I just had the ideas of 2.4, 2.2, and 1.1. A lot of those topics cross over regardless. So challenges, so what challenges does the Catholic Church face today? So again, the abuses, the scandals, mass attendance dropping, and of course other religions, pluralism coming into place to kind of, these are things that are becoming more prominent in Ireland. Community of believers, how they're set up. I have actually put additional notes up now since on topics such as the Muslim Sisters of Era, which really encourage looking at them because they're great ones to talk about regarding community of believers in Ireland alone and across the world, for Islam, of course. But again, my notes are there under those sections coded as follows. Also, primal religions. Now, primal religions wasn't asked too long ago, but the mana, taboo, shaman, totem have been asked for a few years. It's usually a very frequently asked question too. It's a very popular question, so I'd say potentially has a contender coming up. Usually comes up every 2 or 3 years, and I don't think it's been asked last for 2 years at least. But again, that's still fairly recent, so I would say it's probably my least likely, but still, because of popularity, it could come up again, and it was also asked in the mocks as well. Interfaith dialogue, as well as that, is also a frequently asked question. I think the trends I saw has come up every 2 years in the past few years, so potentially could come up again. Again, with everything going on in the world, especially in Israel and Palestine, it's a very topical topic, so again, something you could be asked about. Vision of salvation between faiths, so again, something that sometimes people leave out. Also talk about festivals, something meant to include there as well, so I think these are contenders to Section C. I know I'm giving a lot more, and again, I'm actually almost covering the whole topic, but the ones I think that came up last year were the likes of the Sikh faith, Baha'i faith, the new religious movements, so potentially may not come up this year, but just be conscious of what you see in front of you and how that actually could impact, how they could likely be asked this year, because again, Section C has a lot of kind of repeated topics, reused topics, so I think they have a strong contender coming up. Now, last one in Unit 2 is Section D, the morality topic. Based on my looking through it, I think the moral theories in action question, which hasn't been asked, I think, since 2019, correct me if I'm wrong, but that's the topic of deontology ethics, utilitarianism, hedonism, virtue ethics, those kind of topics. So they haven't been asked in a while. Usually quite a popular question if it's asked too, because a lot of things you can talk about, a lot of examples you can bring in, real world and fictional, but just bear in mind that, again, that was also asked in the mocks, and yes, if that one is answered on, I think it will be quite strict remarking, because again, a lot of students would favour those kind of questions because they're quite, if you did them in class, they can usually be quite topical and can relate a lot to contemporary culture, so make sure you give plenty of examples to go with it. Moral decision making, so regarding how crime and punishment, war, child labour, slavery, these kind of questions have come up frequently enough but haven't come up for a while. So again, how a morally mature person may approach those topics. Again, with everything going on with war in the world at the moment, it's potentially a possibility coming up. So don't be afraid to look at topics such as just war theory. Even if you're not doing Section F, Justice and Peace, I have a big topic on that one there as well. So don't look through it if you have access to the notes. Fundamentalism and relativism. I have not seen it come up for the past few years. Again, correct me if I'm wrong, but it is a potential contender. And if anyone has questions on that one, go to Section D 3.1, talking about basically how that's a very similar question to the patterns of change question in Section C, actually. So talking about how religious views and people have reacted to kind of world changes and pluralism, that kind of thing. So it's quite a nice topic, quite easy to talk about, but especially everything going on with migration issues, it could be a relevant topic to talk about. So again, potential contender. Lastly, this isn't necessarily a contender. Religion and Christianity or morality and Christianity, I should say, and right relationship was asked on last year. But there's always no harm to know the difference between morality and religion. So moral codes such as the five pillars, Ten Commandments. As if you look through my notes, you'll know that I'm very much think the five pillars could be applied to a lot of different topics in religion. So again, I'd recommend knowing that off. Again, knowing the five pillars, I can explain as how it's a moral compass, and also looking at things of Islamic laws, Jewish laws, etc. See how they can connect and clash. So again, I think that could be a potential contender. It's usually a question they ask every year on some sort of religious connection to morality. So last year's religion, Christianity, and it could be kind of a general religious question on morality as well. Okay, so that will conclude it for Unit 2. So going on to our elective topic, I just did a kind of a one single breakdown like this. So again, at least that way it saves those who are only looking at one of these sections individually, you don't have to go scrolling through the slides. So it's all here in one slot. So for section F, Justice and Peace, I reckon something on the environmental crisis. I don't think it came up last year. The Sidrins question, the greening, creation stories, they're usually asked frequently enough in section F when they come up. Bear in mind the trends are a bit different for the elective section because they don't always come up each year. Again, every year is different. Again, some years they might be on the project side of it, so you don't see them on the exam paper. So you might notice you go through exam revision the years prior to it, you might not see, there might be a few years missing for section F, G, I, and J. But yeah, going back to it, just war theory as well. Again, with the wars going on in the world at the moment, it's a potential contender. Again, they're based on what's going on in the world as they are. And religion's reaction to things such as world hunger, poverty, discrimination. So, as you can see, they're all kind of highlighted which codes they are, which notes to follow. Again, I think I'd be surprised if one of those three don't come up for section F. Section G can be quite a broad topic. Meditation, again, came up in the mocks, so it has a potential contender here. Sacraments, I notice, hasn't come up for a few years. And hermitage, apostinia, pilgrimage retreats. The only question I have over that one is it is now a current topic for the fifth year projects. So maybe it may not come up this year, not sure. But again, it hasn't been asked for a few years in exams, so it has a potential contender. And it's usually quite a well answered question when it does come up for those who do section G. For section I, Irish myths, again, has not come up for a few years, and burial rites too as well. One thing I meant to include with that one too is simply section I 1.1. It's a very, very large section where it talks about secularism, secularization, pluralism. But again, if you cover patterns of change in section C and also relativism, fundamentalism and relativism in section D, those three topics will cross over very well. So just make sure you kind of understand that connection. The St. Patrick connection, I didn't see much of it last year, and the last time I saw a St. Patrick question, I think it was about pre-Christian Ireland. But again, that 3.1 section is what I'm trying to say is a potential contender. I'd also say that the options between 3.2 to 3.6, they come up last year, but again, by no means are you restricted to that. Section I is quite a short section, so it's hard to predict it, but because the topics or the units themselves are all quite broad, so topics I have in front of me are likely to come up, but just I'm not sure how they'll be asked. So that's where you just need to be careful. Section J, Darwin and Galileo, I think both of them are on the respective each mock, but they have not been asked for a couple of years now as well. Descartes has been asked for a handful of times in the past 5 years, but doesn't mean they won't ask about him again, because the exams, especially for section J, are very fond of Descartes by the looks of it. Eco-crisis again, so like in section F, I talked about how greening, environmental crisis can come up, and I also addressed about the religion's response to it in section J. So don't be afraid to cross over those notes, especially if you're only doing either section. There's some additional notes in section J, additional notes in section F, and I put the codes down there to look up them. Medical ethics, again, I've not seen come for a few years. And prolonging the ending of human life, cloning, artificially created life, etc. These are all topics that could potentially come up. Again, there's a lot of things you could talk about there. You could talk about topics such as euthanasia, abortion. Cloning itself is very much not necessarily trendy or topical at the moment, but just something, I realised I misspelled cloning there. But just it's potentially a potential topic that has been asked about for the past few years. So yeah, I would recommend looking at these few topics as you see in front of you. Now, I think for the most part that concludes my prediction video, but if anyone has any questions, please contact me through ExamRevision or the email I gave. And just bear in mind as well, these are predictions. Again, I have to give that disclaimer. If you are looking to get more additional revision notes, please follow the links you see on these actual slides. And thank you for listening. Hopefully that was helpful. And I'll give a quick breakdown through the slides as well. They'll be shared to this website as well. So best luck in your Leaving Cert, and hope you don't mind too much that the exam is on the very last day. So that's usually a good thing too. It gives you plenty of time to study and relax and prep for it. All right, best luck.